Welcome to Grid Talk and happy Pride Month. My name is Ruby Price, and today we're here to review the 2025 Austrian Grand Prix at the Red Bull Ring. Joining me today, we have the one, the only Owain Medford.
Hello.
Hello. So, the championship fight has continued in Austria as Lando Norris completed the comeback after chaos in Canada to win in Austria for the first time ahead of his teammate Oscar Piastri, with Ferrari Charles Leclerc a distant P3. Owain, was it all smooth sailing for the Brit who led from pole position and but for a few challenging moves from Piastri, didn't really have that much to do for the latter half of the race?
No, I think the most challenging thing was that he had to kind of avoid traffic, and obviously that kind of ebbed and flowed. There were portions of time where I thought it was going to go away from him, but having the early stop was clearly sort of the better move around Austria. It was clearly sort of too hot to necessarily make any kind of overcut work. So for Piastri, just kind of wasn't able to increase his pace. It's not like he was bottled up behind Norris. I think, if anything, just the slipstream just enabled him to keep within obviously DRS range and make those attacks. And I think as much as Piastri was doing quite well to, make life difficult for Norris, give him sort of compromising positions to have to put his car in, I think Norris handled them fairly well. And it didn't really seem that there was anything that could be done, regarding sort of passing into turn three rather than passing into turn four. Like, normally I'd say Norris, well, basically I think Norris was defending well enough and obviously getting packed past, and there wasn't, he was getting off that turn three hairpin well enough in those under those attacks to actually fend off the issues from Piastri, or the attacks from Piastri at least. And that's was something we saw him do throughout the race. Like, even when towards the closing stages and there was a lot of traffic for Norris to have to get to, which sometimes went against him, but I think went sort of went his way a bit more often. It was that sort of enabled him, being out front at least as well, to get to just keep the position and manage the race from there. For me, that's where I think that he sort of won the race. He didn't, and at a certain point, it was kind of over for Piastri once they were on equal tires. There wasn't anything that Piastri could really do. I mean, he couldn't. The gap was stable at 2 seconds, and there was nothing, and that was it basically.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to say that when McLaren kept Oscar Piastri out at the end of that first stint, after obviously Lando came into pit, like it was just a bit like, what are you actually doing? Because at this point, you're just giving Lando ground. Like, obviously, like it sounded a bit confusing in terms of on the radio when, they were saying to Lando, oh, if Oscar gets past you, don't worry, we'll just box you earlier, which might have been open to interpretation. It did sound like it was a bit of a confusing message for the commentators as well. They were trying to do a bit of deciphering of the McLaren strategy in that scenario. But we didn't see Piastri get ahead in the end, did we? Made some ambitious moves, made one that he probably got told off by the team for trying to, not necessarily, I wouldn't say try to attempt, because it looked like he, maybe was just trying to avoid hitting his teammate when he broke a bit too late. But, the gap at the front now is reduced to just 15 points. Might things have gone a different way were it not for some shoddy racecraft from Argentine Franco Colapinto, who forced Piastri onto the grass when he should have been ceding the position?
I mean, it certainly would have made things a lot easier, obviously. I'm under no impression that being forced off the road is helpful to your race in any way. That tends to go badly. Just ask Daniel Ricciardo from a few years ago when he was at Renault, of all places. But yeah, it definitely obviously cost him time. May have damaged his car a little bit. I haven't got the lap figures. I don't think there was any evidence to say that there was any damage, but it can't help. And I do have to wonder what Colapinto was doing, really, because someone should be telling him. And the blue flags aren't there for Sonoda in front of you,
Just a
so
bit of mood lighting on the track.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It just brightens up the room. But no, yeah, I think that definitely cost him time, at least a second or so, and that may have made the difference. But then again, it might not. I mean, we'll never know, unfortunately. At the end of the day, I'd have liked to have obviously seen the race without that. I think that could have frustrated Piastri a little bit, and it also gives that little bit of a breather for Norris to be able to, lift and coast a bit more, build up his battery, save his tyres, like any number of different things that obviously Piastri didn't have the luxury of. He had to go flat out and try and, in the fairly relatively short period of time that he had left. I think it was lap 64 that was.
Yeah, about that, I think.
Yeah, so like it's not like he has a huge period of time to regroup. You just kind of have to get back on it to try and to try and get at least within the DRS of Norris. So in that respect, I think obviously Piastri didn't have his all his own way, but I'll be honest with you, that's kind of how it goes sometimes. We've seen many a driver be impacted by traffic not doing what it should do and getting out of the way at the right times or in opportune places. And I don't, I think Norris had that a bit today as well. There were times where he got bottled up, particularly through the faster corners, where you would want to make use of your clear air around somewhere where the air isn't particularly dense and you've got high tire deg, making it quite difficult. And obviously, that advantage from being in front is taken away if you're sat there behind that traffic. So yeah, really didn't help Piastri, and it obviously didn't help Norris with those either. But Norris came out on top at the end of the day, and he kind of needed to because he's like you say, it's 15 points, but it was 22. So clearly, he's still on the back foot, and Piastri can afford some of these days. I mean, you wouldn't want any more, but you can afford that at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, when when your teammate doesn't actually score in the previous race and then, there's the gaps wider, like you can afford to finish second to him once or twice, afterwards. But yeah, just, we knew there was going to be traffic issues going into this race. It's a very short circuit. The pack bunches up, particularly when you've also got your front pair going like almost a second a lap quicker than the cars behind them in second and third. Yeah, traffic was 100% predicted, but behaving unpredictably, But yeah, maybe Franco just also needs some blue flag training as well. But, let's have a look at Ferrari then, because let's face it, 2025 has been disappointing Ferrari, despite a sprint win in China for Hamilton. But they brought a new floor here to Austria amongst some other upgrades, and it does seem to have made the car more compliant. Obviously, Fred Vasseur wasn't here, but, is P3 the best Ferrari could manage today?
I think clearly it is. I don't think it was, well, clearly the McLarens were the class of the field, and the class of the field, as you say, by quite a wide margin. Ferraris have, they've not had the best race pace, particularly in the warmer conditions. And I think this is just sort of kind of a worst case scenario for them. I think they've brought the upgrade because they need to put it on the car. And there's not really a case of trying to wait for it to be helpful, but I think what you could take at least some stock in, or sort of at least what is promising, is the fact that this is, as I've said, the worst case scenario for what seems to be Ferrari's weaknesses. It's hot, it's high up, so the air's less dense. You don't get that much mechanical grip. Ferrari hasn't done well, particularly once the temperatures increase, and the fact that they have come home in third and fourth behind very clearly a quick McLaren, I think would give them a lot of confidence. Then at least not for this race. This race is kind of best of a bad bunch, and they've got some decent points out of it. But going into future rounds of the season, I'm thinking, Hungary or Spa or in particular, even the next round in Britain. These tracks aren't too dissimilar, and the bigger benefit is the fact that they should be cooler. You can't, as much as the race today was a bit shaky at the start, particularly for Hamilton. He was under pressure from Russell quite a lot of the time, both on the start and then the restart. But the fact that he was able to drive around the outside and defend from Russell so well, Hamilton that is, I think says that, yeah, this should, Mercedes did have some issues, but this should be going in the right direction. It is going in the right direction. And as much as you can take, you've taken the best that you can from today, and going into the next few rounds, like I say, that's confidence inspiring. And I think it's very clearly evidence of Ferrari at least going in the right direction, when maybe things were, you'd expect this to be a harder race for them to get through. So for them, it's not just a positive result in that respect of the results today, but going forward as well, like I say.
Yeah, definitely. And, Lewis Hamilton finished nearly 30 seconds off Lando Norris at the end of the race, but he was 32 seconds ahead of his former teammate George Russell in his old team. So I think, in all told, really, Lewis will be happy with that. Like, no one wants to finish 30 seconds off the lead, particularly when you're a seven-time world champion. But it was spending his race in no man's land. It just means that you don't end up pushing as much as, you might do if you've got a car within sight and stuff like that. But, the poor result for Mercedes in relative terms, is ultimately only one position behind, but with two Ferraris ahead of them, Ferrari are now P2 in the constructors. So they'll certainly take that, I think, and continuing where they were last season, maybe they just need, like you say, Silverstone, Hungary, Spa, like we could see Ferrari maybe get, if McLaren have an off day, an off weekend, like maybe there's a winning side, but I think it requires something to go wrong for McLaren because they were just so fast today. Yeah. But speaking of Mercedes then, something of a false dawn, I guess you could say. George Russell's strong win in Canada last weekend, last race weekend, I'll phrase it, had us all wondering if the team had finally solved their lack of competitiveness outside of cool conditions. But the heat today in Austria just showed that might have been a little bit optimistic. George Russell was losing about a second a lap to the McLarens overall, finished a whole 62 seconds off and was barely safe from being a lap down at the end of it. But his teammate DNF'd on lap one. Were Mercedes ever actually in it this weekend?
I don't think they were. I mean, we looked in practice and they weren't particularly competitive. And, I just want to talk just very quickly about the Antonelli incident. I don't think there was actually anywhere for him to go. I know he's got a three-place grid drop owing to the fact that he obviously did run into Verstappen and caused that collision. Yes, he was undeniably the cause of the collision. I think as much as obviously it's not intentional, but we don't sort of rule on intent. I think he did kind of the best he could have done. But the fact is, I think it probably did break a bit too late, and in trying to avoid a collision, he's caused another. Having looked back at the footage, I don't think he could have gone left and used the runoff area necessarily. And you don't know who's going to end up there. Obviously, he's unsighted, but the fact is, I think he was going in too hot. From that point onwards, it was a bit difficult. Obviously, Russell, as I said, sort of tried to sort of at least fight with Hamilton, but I think very clearly they didn't have the grip today, and not just talking about the level of grip that they had. As you say, the race pace just wasn't there. It was really an issue for them, and you've got to remember that also this was with sort of quite significant issues for McLaren. With their pit stop times, they were obviously Russell 62 seconds off the lead come the end of the race, and that's with with obviously more traffic because Norris has had to go through more traffic, and the fact that he's also had two slower pit stops, as has Piastri. Yeah, bad day for Mercedes, and I don't think there's much that they could have done really. Clearly the car isn't necessarily suited to here. I think they'll probably go better in some of the other races, but clearly it's still difficult to get into the window, and it could just been a case last weekend or last race weekend, as I made the same mistake you did. That they got it in the window in Canada, and that was it. Where the issue with that obviously is that it's not helpful, and it makes things more difficult going forward. And they've got to fix that. And with the number of races that we've been through, I believe this is the 11th. As you've got to wonder whether they're going to turn off development for the car. So for me, I think it's not quite all rosy at Mercedes, which is difficult to see because obviously that's a team that does know how to win races, and unfortunately they've just kind of been plagued this entire time through this era of cars, and I think that's going to be difficult for them to take. Then again, you'd still take a fifth on a bad weekend, and they've still outperformed a number of teams, leaving them well, they've only dropped 1 point behind Ferrari basically to become third in the championship. That fight's definitely still on, and they're comfortably ahead of Red Bull. And I don't see, Red Bull catching up given the sort of driver lineup that they have, and Mercedes clearly are finishing more races and scoring more points more regularly. So it's a bit of an off weekend, but I think that they'll come back.
Yeah, definitely. And, like just looking back 12 months ago, this was obviously the race that started what was kind of like a couple of race, like strong, like purple patch for Mercedes as well. You had the win in Austria, which obviously George Russell inherited from the two cars ahead of him, and we can stop talking about penalty points for a certain driver now because, that was last year. There was the British Grand Prix where Lewis Hamilton won. We had Spa where, George Russell was winning the race and then, was disqualified for not having for being underweight. So Lewis Hamilton inherited the victory. But then of course, they just kind of fell off. So, as you say, this could be a potentially fruitful couple of races for them, but it just seems to be so circumstantial dependent on the circumstances, and we'll see what happens, I guess. But as you say, like, I wouldn't sniff at a fifth place I wasn't having the best weekend of my season, and I'm sure George Russell won't either. But yes, so if you're enjoying this podcast, we'd love it if you could take five to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on a platform where you can like it, why not do that as well? And just, share it, all that jazz. And if you're listening and aren't currently subscribed to the channel you're listening on, consider helping us out with a subscribe as well. So let's talk about probably, one of the better feel-good stories of this race weekend. Double points for the outgoing Swiss outfit Sauber as Gabriel Bortoleto capitalised on his first Q3 appearance, secured his first ever F1 points ahead of his teammate Nico Hulkenberg, who came from 20th on the grid to finish P9. Almost pointless in 2024. Have Sauber finally turned things around?
I am confident, or at least more confident than I would have otherwise been, in I'm going to go on a limb and say it. I think
If
Sauber
you
have
say
turned
Audi,
Auto Union money. Sorry, the artist formerly known as Auto Union. No, what I would say is that I think that I Sauber have clearly turned a corner. They in a position now where since I know this is only the third race, but in Spain they finished in fifth. In Canada they finished in eighth. They've got a double points finish in a difficult race. That's six vital points, and it tightens up this. I mean, it was seven in commentary. It tightens up this midfield battle. They are only 4 points, outscoring everyone else by 4 points to being able to get into seventh place in the constructors, and if Racing Bulls have a bad weekend, maybe even sixth. I think this is a really kind of I think it's a big uptick in form, and clearly that the upgrade, sorry, that they brought to the car have worked, meaning that yeah, they can actually fight 4 points positions, and that's making that midfield battle just hot up, no end. And because they're all so competitive, it's not as if they're competing against people who got a lucky number of breaks. All of these teams that they're now beating or are scoring more points than are also fairly competitive. And so I think there's a lot of stock to be taken out of that. And it helps to, it's got to at least help with your rookie driver to they get some points on the board. So you've got some points on the board. You've got your experienced drivers scoring, and things kind of, I'm a big believer in momentum, and I think Sauber have gained that momentum. Clearly things are working. I don't want to speak too soon, but I don't see this sort of stopping anytime soon. There's the kind of circuits that they're doing things on, again, useful going forward. They're similar going forward, and they're all sort of old school tracks. I think we could continue to see this from, and I think it's well. I mean, it's nice to see them. It's nice to see them doing well again. Sauber a legendary name in motorsport for good reason. It's nice to see them being competitive and getting successes.
yeah, they are probably one of those teams that, you always end up rooting for. If you're a fan of, motorsport, because, they had that whole independent ethos, they were doing it themselves, they were working with their partners and stuff as well. But, it was the team that, if you saw them running around in P11, you were like, oh, maybe they can get P10. And it always felt weird, when they were making silly organizational mistakes for, legitimate reasons. Like 2015, I think it was, they were running a year-old engine, whilst running a car, I think it was, that looked like your first RC, like toy car and things like that. They've been through some troublesome periods, and, maybe the Vorsprung Deutsch technique or whatever it's called, will have an impact, and certainly might do. But, I also want to say, were it not for the blue flags at the end, we could have seen Bortoleto finish P7 or even P6 because, he was gaining time hand over fist to Alonso and Lawson ahead. But obviously, blue flags, you've got to give way. Maybe both of them should have actually given way to Piastri as well on that final lap. That was something that I was thinking whilst that last lap was going on. But ultimately, the race is finished. It's not ultimately, it probably wasn't going to change how things were ahead of them. But, a strong performance from them nevertheless, and I'm sure we might talk about them later on in the show. But talking about another driver who, like had a very strong showing and has very much been against his own form this season. He's Liam Lawson, get out of his way as the meme goes. But, after his unceremonious sacking from Red Bull only 2 races into the season, it was starting to look like he was just down and out. But strong showing this weekend as the lead car in that Red Bull family saw, Liam Lawson bring it home in P6, making a one-stop strategy work despite having Fernando Alonso lurking behind him for that entire second stint. Like, has Liam finally found some confidence this weekend?
I mean, he must have done. I mean, it's not like he lucked into this. He qualified in sixth as well, and the Racing Bulls have been decent all weekend. I genuinely think that this is, it's good for his confidence, and he deserves it, to be honest, because he had a pretty torrid time at the start of the year, and I think very clearly it's not his fault. Red Bull seem to have, I don't want to sit there and talk about the car, but we have to look at the facts plain as day. If you're developing a car and it's only sort of if results can only be extracted by one driver, and that driver, I don't know, gets taken out at the start of a race, in a hairpin bend when there's a bit of a melee because you end up slightly out of position at the start, or let's say you have a bad start. Verstappen isn't likely to, but it's entirely possible you could. I've seen him, we've seen him have bad starts in the past,
He
whether it be
stalled
raining or
here.
something like that. Yeah, exactly. Nobody's infallible, and you're leaving yourself, if you're literally tying one hand behind your back and you've only got one car that's able to fight for points, you leave yourself in a pretty desperate and vulnerable position. By comparison, Lawson seems to have actually out of the not so much out of the limelight because I don't think it's ever really gone away. Unfortunately, I think the issue of the Red Bull driver program perennially puts you in under pressure and under scrutiny. But maybe the fact that the car is easier to drive, or heaven forbid, developed so that two drivers can drive it, or maybe even more than two, maybe a number of drivers can drive it, mean that the Racing Bulls have they outperformed the Red Bulls in qualifying, sort of on aggregate, and in the race, by quite a wide margin. Hadjar's also doing well. Lawson, I think, has got a bit of his mojo back. He doesn't look so downtrodden. I hope that this continues, and I hope that some lessons are taken from the fact that, like I say, on aggregate, the Racing Bulls are performing better than the Red Bulls right now, despite how the points may, sort of show. Obviously, we have a non-linear point scale, which skews things a bit. But like I say, the Racing Bulls really are doing a lot with what they have, and it's working out well for them. And I think it's that they're kind of the team that will be a bit difficult for someone like Sauber or maybe Haas if they have a better weekend to beat. So yeah, I really think that Dawson's doing great, and I hope that continues. I hope he's allowed to stay there and develop, and build a base in himself that he knows I can do this. I'm not, I wasn't promoted too soon. I was just put in the wrong place.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it shows, as you just said, exactly what, the problem is with Red Bull. Yuki Tsunoda, let's talk about him, has finished last of the runners, 2 laps down. He had a 10-second penalty for forcing Franco Colapinto off, just to, mention that. But, when Max Verstappen DNFs in the first lap and on turn three, all of a sudden Red Bull have got twice the resources to coach their driver to, a position where, maybe he actually does get a point, or God forbid, a couple of them. But he just had zero confidence in the car this weekend on a lap that's 1 minute and 4 seconds. When you're in hot lap conditions, yeah, yeah, Yuki Tsunoda should not have been finishing last and 2 laps down in this race context. Red Bull's home circuit. But, what is their solution other than change their car? I would put another word in, but we unfortunately have to think about these kind of things, just to reference more memes. But yes, a strong performance from Liam Lawson. I hope it continues. It would be a shame, I think, to see, potentially very talented driver out of the sport so soon into his own career, and I'm sure we all echo that sentiment as well. And, we've got to talk about this, Owain. Williams' woes continuing, a disappointing qualifier on Saturday. Carlos Sainz did not even make the race start after being stuck in first gear on the grid, and then had that double brake fire in the pit lane. Alex Albon running a lofty P6 before pitting on lap 13, and then being told to box to retire the car. We've already mentioned most of their rival teams picked up a sizable chunk of points today. This is just more things that Williams do not need. At a circuit where they got pole position in 2014 with Felipe Massa.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's come from the fact that they had a very, very well, they had the best engine on the grid, let's be honest, and a philosophy with how their car was that enabled them to do well. But as you do say, yeah, it's not been great reliability wise. This isn't the first either, or sort of retirements that they've had. I don't know what caused Albon to have to retire. I don't think it. I think it may have appeared that the car was stuck in first gear. Obviously, I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm not in the team. I don't know. I haven't got access to all the data, but the fact that the brakes were stuck on the entire lap says to me that there must have been some issue to do with the brakes. Obviously, they were very, very hot, and that they weren't cooling down. I think I was sort of explaining that during watching the race, but once they get over a certain period, they just start to degrade, and once they start on fire, that's kind of it. They can deal with a small amount of fire, but yeah, beyond that, you're starting to burn the carbon. It becomes about damage limitation, really. Again, this is okay for Williams. They're not necessarily looking, well, at least externally, they've been given off the idea that they're not too bothered about the years leading up to 2026, as long as 2026 is right. But you would hope that these little niggles and finger trouble and things like that are starting to go away and be less and less often. Obviously, they've got two solid drivers, so they're not having the collision damage that they're having to repair, and they still do have a little bit of a points margin. But you want to see this sort of thing start to go away and become operationally very, very good. I don't know whether these two things, whether the two sort of results or retirements were related. I'd hazard a guess no, but it does add insult to injury when 13 laps in, you've not even made the start, and where at the time where you'd be normally thinking about your first pit stop, you're sitting there going, well, we've got two cars in the garage, let's pack up and go home. That's obviously very, very disappointing for them. Whether parts fail. I mean, that happens a lot. Parts fail, things go wrong, and occasionally you're going to get that. But to have it happen twice on the same weekend raises questions, and it's not been an isolated incident. We have seen other things of that, so other things like that for Williams. So hopefully it is just an isolated incident and an incredible run of bad luck. But it's obviously not good to have that happen and cede points in quite a tense and close battle, particularly when other teams seem to pick up their to have yours be on a bit of a downturn. So I'm sure that there'll be a big debrief and try to ensure that this never happens again, whatever issues there were. But obviously, yeah, it puts the heat on Williams a little bit more on an already hot day.
Yeah, exactly. And with, neither Red Bull scoring points and a Mercedes also, not finishing the race, like, could have been an opportunity for them to pick up more points than you'd usually expect. As I say, Alex Albon was running in P6 before having to retire. So that could have been, a sizable chunk of points just to keep that points gap they've got back to P6, and extend that. But, ultimately they'll be hoping for better in Silverstone. They do generally like Alex Albon has at least gone well around there recently. Carlos Sainz, I think got his first victory here in 2022, 23. I might be misremembering, but I know he got a win that his teammate was angling for. But, anyway, Williams, better luck next time. Better luck in, just under a week's time from now. So let's take a look at our driver of the day. Now, Grid Talk, I think for the first time in quite a while, has actually had a tie for driver of the day. Two votes going to Nico Hulkenberg, two votes going to Gabriel Bortoleto. Does that make it a Sauber? Owain, who was your driver of the day, please?
I decided to buck the trend and give it to Esteban Ocon. And what I've done is work after a little bit of scrutiny from yourself, Rubu, have worked backwards to justify Ocon. That's the reason we have a tie, by the way. Still, I hadn't voted, and then I went with Ocon because he started from 17th on the grid, obviously owing to Carlos Sainz's retirement. And I think that, bearing in mind that Sauber have clearly a better car, which does, I think, you can give them well, you have to give them credit for that. The fact that that Haas managed to pick up points with Ocon with quite clearly a worse car, although only marginally, I think says more about Ocon's ability as you know as experienced as Hulkenberg is by comparison. You know, both of them are experienced drivers, and they've got rookies in Bortoleto and Behrman. They're kind of the opposites of each other as teams in some ways, or you know they're they're kind of the same in a similar position, more like. But I think that Ocon has more outperformed his car than maybe Hulkenberg or Bortoleto have. That's why I gave it to Ocon as driver of the day. I think sort of getting those points on the days where other teams don't is where you really have to make use. Have to take advantage of it, and that's exactly what Ocon's done. That isn't to say, I think I would agree that Bortoleto and Hulkenberg are equally good mentions. They could be Hulkenberg more than Bortoleto, but then again, Bortoleto is a rookie. Like, let's not forget that. So I don't think that either of these three options would be bad options as driver of the day. I just picked Ocon because of that.
Yeah, and I think it's a very valid choice of driver of the day. I was just annoyed that, it meant that you weren't breaking a tie when it was so perfectly set up for you to come in and be the tiebreaker, and you just choose, no, I'll go plan C.
I want to point out. I want to point out. I am known as someone who hedges their bets on the podcast quite a lot when it comes to the predictions. So, to be honest with you, I think that's perfectly on brand.
It is. It's definitely very on brand. But, fair play to Esteban Ocon. 2 races in a row. I think he's finished P10 now for Haas. And, he's bringing those points in, as you say, as the more experienced driver, outperforming the car for sure. Because that Haas is not, it's certainly not the car that they had in 2016, I think it was. And, they're certainly a team that
When you
struggles.
can buy parts from Ferrari, it's usually pretty good.
Yeah, usually. But yeah, like, Nico Hulkenberg starting last on the grid, and then obviously Carlos Sainz gave him a free position, but to come through and to just be in that position, Gabriel Bortoleto starting P8, I think it was, and finishing P8, with potentially higher positions if circumstances went his way. But, you know, circumstances in Formula One, they don't always line up as you want them to do so, do they? But yeah, I think, Sauber slash Ocon is a good representative of this race. Yeah. So, Owain, anything you want to plug at this opportunity as we wrap
I'd
things
like to.
up?
Sorry, I apologise. I just got a bit too eager, but I'd like to plug my absolutely abysmal performance, which in the Grid Talk Driver Challenge, sorry, Prediction Challenge. I apologise, where I picked up I think a grand total of 1 whole point. But if you'd like to see the full results, then make sure you check that out on our Grid Talk social channels. That's at Grid Talk UK on all of the social media platforms with the at, where you can see some of the goings on and some of the astoundingly good performances from some of our team, panelists and team members who have rocketed up the standings, much to my chagrin. But to catch all of that, you'll have to go to our Grid Talk social channels at Grid Talk UK.
Yes, please do go and check out Grid Talk on social media. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make sure that we're actually active on social media. And if you want to find me on anything, it's at Ruby Rose Price on Instagram and Threads, and at Rubes on Blue Sky. And Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Can't remember if I said that one. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our huge back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content, including a Patreon exclusive podcast. Also, make sure you subscribe so you're first to know when each new episode is released, and we'll be back soon with plenty more F1 content. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast, and goodbye.